รายการต่อไปนี้เป็นรายการทั่วไปสามารถรับชมได้ทุกวัย
สนับสนุนโดยยูโรเค้กอร่อยทุกที่ทุกเวลาพรีเมียมเอาท์เล็ตแฟคทอรี่เอาท์เล็ตของแบรนด์เนมระดับพรีเมียมโดเน่ป๊อปบีนเขียวมันหอมอร่อย
Well, 2 years ago, Paul and I were sitting perhaps up there to do the interview. It was a great interview. But a lot of Unilever people complained later on that they did not see us in real life. They were watching TV, and that is not satisfactory. So this time, your people say that we will have to face the people here of Unilever. And I think that you're all very happy to see the big boss here talking about global issues. Any of you watch my Facebook Live? See? I've now turned from a broadcaster, Paul, into a social media journalist as well, meaning that I do Facebook Live programs every day.
Wow.
Yes, talking to all kinds of people. And I hope one day I can call you up in London and talk to me from your mobile phone.
I'm happy to do that.
Yeah? Yes?
I've done it.
Yeah, you have done it.
It seems to be the modern media of today. Yeah.
2 years ago, we talked about the Paris Agreement,
Yeah.
2015. And I think you were on the way to Paris
Correct.
before we talked. And suddenly, when Donald Trump came up, went into the White House, he said, no, Paris Agreement is bad. We don't like it. So I thought about you immediately. But I said, Paul told me it was good. And Donald Trump says it's bad. So something must be wrong with Trump or with Paul.
So the question to you is, who do you believe?
Why? I have to believe in the majority of the world, right? Now, on the list, on the left-hand side of those who take part in the Paris Agreement, how many countries?
196.
196. On the right-hand side, there was only one country which does not take part in Paris Agreement, and that is the United States of America. What a shame.
Yeah. The two countries actually that did not sign in the beginning were Nicaragua and Syria for different reasons, and they've actually signed now.
They have.
Yeah, Syria was just the last one, just at the bomb, because I just came from Bonn for the COP23. So let's just go to your question, because it is a serious question, but also something that I think we can address. It is very clear that the Paris Agreement, after I saw you, is probably one of the best agreements the world has ever signed, because to get 196 countries to come together in Paris and say we are going to decarbonize the global economy,
Yes.
including the Thai government, where you've made a commitment to have a 20% reduction by 2030 as a starting point. But every country came in with what was then called intended nationally determined commitments,
Yes.
INDCs, to keep it simple. And indeed, Paris, on a voluntary basis, achieved far more than the previous Kyoto Protocol or many other things. By asking each country to come with their own commitments, unaudited, unpressured, you actually had everybody buying in, contributing, and we bent the curve that was on a 4 degree, which would have been an absolute disaster, to about 2.7 degrees. Not enough, but Paris was always designed as a mechanism to ratchet it up over time. And the next ratcheting is actually happening in 2018.
Right.
That's why this year was so important, because it's all the preparations for next year. So then fast forward, presidential elections after Obama, John Kerry signed the Paris Agreement. And Trump is of the belief that if all countries sign it, it must be bad for the US. Just like he did with TTIP here. If everybody signs it, it must be bad for the US. Because they all sign it because it's bad for the US.
Right.
That's how he reasons. So I said, when the rumors came out that he was going to go out of the Paris Agreement and the US has been instrumental in getting all countries to increase their ambition. John Kerry, to a great extent at that time as Secretary of State, and Obama to a lesser extent have done an amazing job actually preparing the world for Paris. So there's a role for the US that is still to be played. It was one of the more unpleasant meetings, may I say, but it was very clear that although some people around him clearly understood that staying in is better because the economic forces are already pointing in that direction. In fact, the majority of people in the US, even Republicans, would believe there's climate change, and also the majority wants to stay in the Paris Agreement. For some reason, then he decided unilaterally to go out. Now,
That was Trump or Obama?
no, this is Trump himself
You
that
met
decided
Trump.
to go out.
You met Trump.
Well, yes, because I have a very simple philosophy in life is that if I don't try with all of my possibilities to convince someone from the things that we believe in is right, then I also would have felt very miserable if he would have taken that decision and I wouldn't have done anything. It would have taken away my possibilities to criticize him or to work that. So I felt that was, having been heavily involved in the climate change negotiations, that was more of an obligation.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it did not work. So what we saw was, as soon as Trump made the announcement to go out of the Paris Agreement, you actually saw the whole US rallying behind the Paris Agreement.
Sure, yeah.
And we created a movement that now has 4,600 companies, states and cities, a movement that is called We Are Still In. Jerry Brown, Bloomberg are the key drivers or the face of that movement.
Right.
But we have seen more companies sign up than we could ever imagine. More groundswell of we should do something, even more so than we originally committed in Paris, than there was before Trump made his decision. So although we might have lost the moral force of the United States in convincing other countries to increase its ambitions, we certainly have created a movement in the United States to move faster. And part of that is really why we shouldn't worry so much are the economic forces.
Yeah.
Trump said, I will create coal again and open coal mines and create jobs.
Right.
Well, that was political blah blah. The reality is that in the last 10 years there's only one coal mine in the US in Nebraska that was opened. But most coal mines are closing.
Yeah.
And the ones that are open are heavily automated because the economics of coal, now that there is shale gas in the US, for example, just doesn't make any sense anymore. You see a company like Tesla, which sells less than 1/10 of the cars, even far less than 1/100 of the cars of General Motors, having the same market cap already. And the reason is that people are betting on the future technologies of electric cars. And the number of jobs that are being created in the green energy sector in the US are 10 times bigger than in the fossil sector. So the economic forces have made a decision. Trump is, in that sense, a little bit of an outlier.
Right.
It takes him 4 years to go out of Paris because the way that this is set up is you can't just go out.
No.
So by the time he really has to make the decision if he goes out or not, I think things have changed dramatically, that it might well be that they will stay in and be part of it.
And he may not be there for too long.
That is another possibility. That's a separate discussion.
You said it was an unpleasant encounter with President Trump. How unpleasant was it?
Well,
What did he say to you?
if you have two people that believe in something very strongly and it happens to be different beliefs, then these meetings normally are not so pleasant.
No.
It's like a retailer who wants a lower price at the moment that you want to increase your price. Those are not the best meetings that we participate in. But we try to show that for the US, it would be a competitive advantage for the US, which has always led the world in many areas on technology, that they would also be in an advantageous position. Many of the technologies, even around green energy, especially when it gets to the car industry, are actually coming from the US. And if you would be excluded from that, then that would be, you would be at a competitive disadvantage. China is really taking the lead now in
I was going to ask
solar
about
and solar
China.
technology.
China seems to have taken the place of the United States in many areas of global importance.
Yeah.
Free trade,
Yeah.
climate change. In climate change especially, how do you find China's role now, from now on? Would China really be leading the world in this area?
Yeah, so I was with Xi Jinping in 2016, early 2016, when he gave a very good speech, basically saying that the time that China was a developing country and as a result could not take responsibilities outside of its borders, that time had changed. You have the One Belt, One Road now that you're well familiar with in this part of the world.
Of course, yeah.
And you also have seen that China is increasingly asserting itself in the global arena, and seeing the role as an opportunity actually to fill a vacuum that the US might be leaving behind. And frankly, they're playing it fairly well. On climate change specifically, which is where your question is, China obviously, as a major country, has already seen the limits of the planetary boundaries.
Yeah.
When the cities are so polluted, right now we live in a world where 9 million people die because of air pollution. Many of them are in China and India.
ช่วงห
But
น้า
if you really believe in the longer term, that means a sustainable business model. You also have to really be concerned about sustainability in the first place. And if you do that, or when you do that, you actually start to discover enormous opportunities. Unilever, in many of its innovations, has been able to accelerate because it thinks about addressing these planetary boundaries.
Closer to home, your Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which you launched in 2010, I remember.
That's about right.
Yes.
Yeah, good
What are some of the successes? What are some of the challenges or failures?
Yeah. Well, broadly what we have found was what we were saying at that time, to decouple growth from our environmental impact, to increase our overall social impact, to link that, these are the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes,
But
yes.
to link our Unilever Sustainable Living Plan to the brands that we sell, make these brands more brands with purpose, broadly has been very positive. And I think the reason that it has resonated so well with society at large is unfortunately that since we started it, the challenges of society have only become bigger, and probably bigger than we thought even in 2010.
Yeah.
So the relevance of that plan is even more so. But the challenges are there, there's no question about it. We were 10% sustainably sourced, we are now about 60% sustainably sourced. So what took us 100 years to get to 10, now we have leapfrogged to 60. But the next 20, 30 will become more challenging, you understand that. But our carbon emission reductions have been about 40% over this period of time. Quite aggressively. Our water reductions about the same, including here in Thailand. But we are now getting to states in our Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which by the way is a plan that will live for a long time to come, where in order to make changes and really have impact, we need governments, we need industry to work together, because they are more transformative changes than we alone can do. You can only do so much by yourself or with your own value chain. So the main challenge that we now look at is how do you drive more transformative changes in society. For example, if you want to attack climate change and you want to green your whole value chain, you can do it quicker if you have a price on carbon.
Sure.
So China is now going to a carbon trading system. With China going, about 22.5% of the global carbon emissions are under a price of carbon or a carbon trading cap and trade system, as they call it.
Yeah.
So that will accelerate things. So you now need to think a little bit more about more of these transformative changes.
Eventually, do you foresee a universal tax on carbon?
I don't think that will be easy to implement a global tax on carbon, because a carbon policy needs to be in function of a total green growth policy. And countries like you have now, do you see a universal tax rate, a corporate tax rate? You won't see that either. But you would have border adjustments for carbon. If a country decides not to implement a carbon tax and exports carbon, so to speak, by subsidizing it in their own country because they're not pricing it, I think you will see countries adjusting for that. Because the negative consequences of carbon emission are actually global. They're not just in the country that is violating. So you might not have the same global price on carbon, but the direction is there. Mechanisms might be different, but ultimately we need to get to about $100 per ton. And right now, most countries that are thinking about it are in the $20 to $30 per ton. But if we really want to solve this, some distance to go. I was in Colombia the other day with President Santos, and we had convinced them to implement a price on carbon, and they are getting revenues of about $200 million in Colombia, which is for them not a small amount. And what we were trying to talk with him was, why don't you use part of that guaranteed revenue that is in your carbon pricing scheme and use that to guarantee green financing? So he could actually service the debt on a bond that with 100 million, he could service the debt on a bond that is $1 billion. So you put in a carbon tax, you get 100 million from the tax. You issue a green bond, you can actually finance up to $1 billion. And you use that $1 billion to train farmers in climate smart agriculture, to retrain the FARC so they don't go back to terrorism, to protect the forests.
How many countries can do that?
Oh, many countries. In any country I talk to, and when I go around, more and more of the countries have now the possibilities to put these blended financing programs in place. And actually, even if they are least developed countries, there are more and more possibilities, I think, that are opening up. So we need to unlock the financial market. Unfortunately, we're living in a world where about $13 trillion of money is earning negative interest rates right now. Since the financial crisis, we've put a lot of money in the global economy, and that money hasn't really created economic growth. So we are saying use some of that money smartly and use that as catalyzing to drive a sustainable development agenda, and that would accelerate our Unilever Sustainable Living Plan as well. So it's more about these transformative changes that
a lot of companies would like to have their living plan like Unilever, Sustainable Living Plan, but it's not easy. So when people come to you and say, Paul, how do we do it? Where do we start? How do you tell them? What do you tell them?
Well, and indeed, many people come to us, and fortunately, there are more and more companies. They might not do exactly what we do, but then, we don't have the eternal wisdom either. If there is something better out there, or if it's not yet 100% the right time. But broadly, more and more companies understand that their models need to be more sustainable, that the social aspect of businesses are increasingly being looked at, so that they need to be more responsible. So we are going in the right direction. We might have a comprehensive program that probably doesn't have its equals yet, but parts of that you would find back in other companies. But what I would tell them very simple is, I would have a discussion with the CEO first, and see if the CEO is really driven by a deeper sense of purpose. If the CEO is not committed, as they say, the fish starts rotting at the head. It doesn't work. So you need to get the CEO be aligned. Then you help as much as you can to put a program in place in your own shop. I call it earning a seat at the table.
A seat at the table.
It's very hard to ask other people to do things if you're not doing it yourself.
First, they have to convince the board of directors.
Board of directors on the seat at the table would be part of that. You have to be sure that, and I'm very fortunate with my board, obviously, that they fully buy in. And over time, you select the board based on...
Not after a lot of discussions and quarrels and arguments.
Continuous. It will always be continuous, because there are always trade-offs in life, and and you make the longer-term trade-offs, the shorter-term pressures. So you need to deal with that. But the first thing a CEO needs to do is be convinced himself, and then he needs to internalize that into their company, setting their own goals and targets on the areas of importance, convincing their boards, having the narrative. And then after you've done that, you work in your value chain, because it's easier with your suppliers, and you can have a bigger effect in that sense. And then once you're done with that, if you want to, or once you get that well established, you move a little bit beyond that to industry level advocacy, and you start speaking out. You become more transformative. For example, we saw a lot of the CEOs signing the Paris Agreement, or saying we need a Paris Agreement. Or LGBT in the US, when a lot of states said we don't want to respect the individual rights to, individual person's right to sexual orientation. A lot of the CEOs spoke up, and things started to change. So advocacy ultimately is very important, increasingly in this environment, because not only here, but in any country that you go to, the political environment is difficult, because our global system of governance really hasn't adjusted since Bretton Woods.
No.
When we put these institutions in place, the World Bank, the OECD, the WTO, IMF, all these institutions were designed in 1944 when 80% of the world economy was in Europe and the US, the Security Council, all these things.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, the world has changed quite dramatically since 1944. A company like Unilever or any company would have had 20, 30 restructuring programs. But unfortunately, the world's global governance never has restructured itself. That's why you see China setting up now its own Asian investment or infrastructure bank, or other people. But the issues have become more global: financial market, climate change, security, planetary boundaries. So these issues have become more global, whilst unfortunately our governance, the US being a great example of that, has become more inward focused. So this multipolar world requires businesses to take a more active role to start de-risking the political process.
But a lot of executives will find it very difficult to convince the board and the shareholders, because they look at profit not being the same thing as being friendly to the climate. Because if you start talking about sustainable plan, it means that it cuts into your profit.
Well, that's an assumption you are now making that you're trying to put on the table. But the reality is...
Well, a lot of people will tell you this, that Paul, it's great. What you're talking about is great. When I go back to the board of directors and I talk to the shareholders, they say, hey, we are a business. We make profit. We don't do all this NGO thing.
There are...
Not unlike Paul, that guy, you know, he's special. He's somewhere else.
So what Unilever is showing is, and this is not just a Unilever example, but I'll bring it to the macro level. What Unilever is showing is our shareholder return over the last 9 years has been 300%. We have continued to grow globally at twice the rate of the market. What was a $38 billion business is now a $55 billion business. In a global economy, frankly, that hasn't done so well.
No.
So we are showing that a longer-term responsible business model doesn't have to compromise any of your stakeholders. Our investor community is broadly happy. And the reasons for that is we also don't boil the ocean at once, or we don't eat the elephant in one bite. You need to be careful. But there are now 46 countries in the world where green energy is already cheaper than fossil fuel. You'd be stupid not to use green energy. In Unilever in Europe and the US, we have made all of our factories green energy. We've actually put a wind farm in Texas ourselves. I have now zero cost of energy.
Zero.
Because you don't pay for wind or solar. Once you have it installed, the cost of energy drops to very low levels. And the payouts are less than 3 years for any of the projects we're involved in. We run our factories at zero waste. But these factories have higher quality, people are more motivated. We save money because we don't waste anything. So many people say, if you do something right, it must cost you money, or there must be something to it, because that's the way, unfortunately, the human brain has been trained over the last few decades, which is very unfortunate. But what we have shown at a global level is that if you, and China is a great example of what we just talked, if you don't attack the issues of planetary boundaries, if you don't attack the issues of climate change, there is no growth. You don't have a choice. India might say, attacking air pollution costs us money. Well, look at the cost of Delhi having been shut down 2 weeks ago, and the economic cost of that. Look at the cost of the Texas and Florida climate change disasters, which have cost the US over $200 billion already to date. So we're getting at this point right now that not attacking these issues actually costs you more. In the food industry, which is part of our business, in 20 years' time, all the profits will be wiped out if these issues right now are not dealt with. So for businesses, it's important to get involved, and convincing their boards is important if they believe in the long term for their companies. If they only believe in the short term, don't worry about it, but that would be stupid. But if you really believe in the longer term, that means a sustainable business model. You also have to really be concerned about sustainability in the first place. And if you do that, or when you do that, you actually start to discover enormous opportunities. Unilever, in many of its innovations, has been able to accelerate because it thinks about addressing these planetary boundaries. When water is short, we invent bar soaps that only need 10 seconds of washing versus 30 seconds. We invent waterless shampoos, which are doing very well for us. We now have a detergent in Africa that we launched, which is growing very fast, where you only need to do 1 rinse instead of 3 rinses in the hand wash, because there simply isn't water. So you save a woman 1 hour a day, which she can invest in her children and in many other things, a little micro-entrepreneur, whatever it is. But you also address an issue like planetary boundaries, in this case water. We think about our supply chain. I'm going next week, after next week, I go to Africa, to Rwanda, to open a new tea plantation for us. Because we think about climate change, changing weather patterns, and we put alternative sourcing in place. It might be only 3 or 5 years from now that is an issue, but we are prepared for that. So boards have that responsibility to demand from management that the plans that they put in place guarantee the long-term viability of a company, and that brings you very quickly then to the area of sustainability that we are talking about. So it's a moral partnership for the common good. And actually, as a result, we made this goal number 17, which is one goal that I always champion, because that partnership, again, is the foundation for all the other sustainable development goals.
Correct. You were co-founder of the so-called Global Commission on Business and Sustainable Development. What is your expectation of that?
So here the chart that they just showed on the sustainable development.
Yes,
so here is the dilemma. If you run a business, here is the dilemma.
Yeah.
When we had the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which is goal number 13, it's called climate action. If you look at goal number 13,
13,
climate action.
there,
Yeah.
yes.
I happen to know all the goals having worked on them. But if you go to a CEO and say climate change, and this is how it affects your business model, he says, I get it. And if you don't do it, people are going to attack you or your business is going to be at risk. I get it. Tell me what to do, I'll be part of it. But now the same year, the UN said climate change alone is not enough. Although that's the most burning issue, we have some other issues.
Right.
In many countries, women don't have the same right as men. In some countries, we don't have good governance. In other countries, we have an issue with the oceans or issue with land or the forests. So we have many issues that need to be addressed. So we created the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals that you see here. Goal number 1 from poverty alleviation all the way down to goal number 17.
Can we go
so
one by one so you can tell us what progress?
So
What
I'll do that
progress?
in a second. So what we did with the commission was,
Please memorize the 17 goals because you're going to get a test from Paul. And your next promotion will depend on the result.
so I'll tell you in a minute, but the story of the commission. So in order to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, we need the private sector to be behind that. If you as a business can explain what your contributions are to the Sustainable Development Goal, and you aggregate that globally, you actually will make an impact and solve these goals. So the task was, how do we get 1,000 CEOs of the big publicly traded companies to report on their contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals? I thought I liked that because, and that's why I created this commission, because it brings purpose to business.
Sure.
Now, it's more complicated than climate change. So we created this commission to develop a narrative and look at the economic opportunity. Business will only get really into action, not just for the moral reasons. Some do, but not enough, clearly. Otherwise, we would not have had the issues in the first place.
Right.
But the economic forces are very powerful. So we said, in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals and only focusing on 4 areas, we took energy, we took food and land use, we took cities and mobility, and the health and well-being, 4 areas. We found an economic opportunity of $12 trillion for the business community.
Wow.
With an investment, as I mentioned, of $3 to $4 trillion. So this is becoming probably one of the biggest payout propositions at a time that everybody is looking for economic growth and job creation.
So this will be the biggest attraction.
Absolutely. And what we have seen is, as a result, not difficult to then enroll about 1,000 CEOs, and hopefully start this galvanizing action. The Secretary General in the UN has appointed 17 SDG advocates. I happen to be one of them. Jack Ma is actually one of the advocates. So we, as 17 of us, Queen Rana from Jordan, or many others, so we try to then advocate, obviously, the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So how well have we done? We are now 2 years into the Sustainable Development Goals. If you because these are 15-year time horizons. The original goals that Kofi Annan, who was at that time the Secretary General at the UN, started the Millennial Development Goals. And if you remember, these were 8 goals, simpler. World was simpler then. And these goals had as a simple objective to halve the number of people living in poverty. At that time in 2000, if you and I would be back to 2000, poverty was defined at earning less than $1.25 a day. Now it's moved to $1.95, $1.75, and some $1.95. But we have actually, in the 15 years from 2000 to 2015, we actually have halved the number of people living in poverty. China has been a big factor, but many other countries. So the Millennial Development Goals have been a success. Those goals were unique at that time. Climate change wasn't in there. Partnership was not so well defined. Issues of HIV, AIDS were obviously on the foreground, so they featured prominently. But lo and behold, we've done a great job. So we've gone halfway in halving the number of people in poverty. We're 2 years in to the Sustainable Development Goals of the 15 years. And frankly, the awareness is rapidly increasing, especially amongst young people, millennial generation especially. You see some goals that were actually having made great progress, like climate change.
No poverty, number one.
Well, no poverty, we're actually still...
You were explaining about...
We are lifting still people out of poverty, but obviously if we don't attack climate change, more people will go back into poverty. So
no hunger?
No hunger. We have 800 million people still going to bed hungry, so there's a job to be done still. No reason for that to happen today. It could be you and me, but we were born in the right place.
But you have a deadline of no poverty at all in...
No poverty in 15 years, no hunger in 15 years.
No hunger in 15 years.
So it can be done. What we have to really do is look at our total food and land use system and obviously work together to do it in a responsible way. We waste food, the 30% of the food that we waste costs us 800 billion a year. We only need 80 billion to feed these poor people. Can be done. Often you find that in the bottom of the pyramid where poor farmers are monocrop farmers. They're also hungry. They don't get enough nutrition. So poverty and hunger are probably the same people.
And good health and
well-being. Good health and well-being, moving up. But the biggest issue that we're now getting, diabetes. For the first time in this world, more people dying of diabetes 2 and obesity than of malnutrition. Not good. So we have to move to a healthier lifestyle.
These are mostly non-communicable diseases, right?
Non-communicable diseases is the main cause of death actually in the world.
Job to be done.
Education, people understand right now that the main investment that you need to do to make all these goals come alive is invest in education. 3.5 billion people in this world, no access to education yet, and unfortunately 70% of those are women. Any economy where women have less opportunities than men, direct correlation with the development of that economy. So we do need to get into goal number 5. That's why it's next to that, is the goal of gender equality. Closely linked to education, as you can imagine.
But I noticed there are more women here than...
that's why we lift the Sustainable Development Goals.
Gender equality, all right.
Gender equality we talked about, absolutely important, especially girls as well. We put girls in there and women. What you now see is because of climate change, because of wars and conflicts in the world, we have more refugees than at any time in human history. 124 million displaced people. So that's not a good picture. The numbers are actually going up. Increasingly more climate change refugees as well. These people are obviously, especially the women in that group of people, are being abused. Gender equality, slave labor, child labor, all fits under that. We need to fight for that. Otherwise, we risk slipping back.
Clean water, sanitation.
Water is a big issue. We will have shortage of water and water issues all across the world before we have the climate change issues. You already see on water that some wars are breaking out. I was in Chennai, and then the next province where Bangalore is, both of them had water rights. There's not enough water, they start fighting. Even within countries, you see already conflicts breaking out because of water.
Yeah.
So if you realize that only 1% or so of the water that is drinkable is accessible to human beings, if the water consumption is going to double in the next 30 years, if 80% of the water is actually polluted, we have to be very careful there and think about it. Creating more circular economies and responsible production methods around water, which actually brings you to goal 12 in a minute.
Yeah. 7?
7 is affordable and clean energy. So whilst you need to attack climate change, the energy needs to be given to many people. If you don't have energy, then the kids can't study at night, can't read. So energy is important, and affordable energy is very important. We're making good progress because it's economically now many things. You can put a solar panel on everybody's house now and have a microgrid, and it's actually subscription systems or not, people can actually afford it more and more. Good progress on that.
Yeah.
Decent work and economic growth, we have to watch out. Because increasingly with the technology revolution, the people that are not digitally included will fall behind, and we end up splitting the population even more.
So that's the challenge there.
That is a big challenge there. Industry, innovation.
Innovation?
Well, innovation, industry would always say we're innovating like mad. The bigger challenge there, I would say, on innovation right now is finding a way to do carbon capture and storage. We can probably not only mitigate, we also have to build, attack the issues that we've already created, and carbon capture storage is a big
inequalities?
Reduced inequalities, I
in
think.
every way, right? Inequalities.
Absolutely. And inequalities is not only meant here as gender, but inequalities are basically the Gini coefficient. Societies that do better is where there is a bigger middle class. A bigger middle class also tends to drive democracy and all the other things. So having more people benefit from this inclusion is a good thing economically as well. Sustainable cities and communities. Very simple statistic. We now have 7 billion people, I keep it simple, 7 billion people on Earth, 50% living in cities, 3.5 billion people in cities. The world goes to 10 billion people with 70% living in cities. Urbanization is one of the main drivers of growth, which means that cities will move from 3.5 billion people to 7 billion people. If you bear with me, it means that we need to build the same number of cities in this world in the next 30 years as we have currently in this world. Which is
possible or not?
Which is every 6 to 7 weeks we have to build a new New York to accommodate this population growth. So how we are going to build these cities is going to decide how we're going to live. 90 trillion of investments will go into cities in the next 15 years, 6 trillion a year. So are we providing good public transport? Are we building it in the right density? How do we deal with sustainable food supply? So designing these cities properly, especially since they are in the emerging markets, where most of these cities are. How do we build them? Because if they are in coastal cities, right now 150 million people live in areas that will be underwater if you get 1 meter higher sea levels, which is going to happen. So building these cities properly, thinking about it in a sustainable way, absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
But having to build as many as currently are in this world is a good task. Responsible consumption and production, we've talked about that.
Yeah.
We are using up the planetary resources. Yeah. There is 1.4 billion people in this world that use the same resource, that use 75% of the world's resources. 1.4 billion people using 75% of the world's resources. And all the others aspire to do the same. At a time that we already use more resources than we can replenish. WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, calculates that we already live off 2.5 planet Earth the way we consume. So this is why that symbol is there, this is about the circular economy. Instead of having a linear economy, which we have currently, we dig the materials out of the ground, we send it into a factory and create a bottle that we then dump in the ocean or the landfill. We have to be sure that every material is reused or upscaled. And that is what is called the circular economy.
You see the rain, the water, and then it goes up again.
Absolutely.
And then you see
It's
the clouds, and then this is the circular thing.
It's like Mother Nature. Nothing actually goes wasted in nature. But we invented waste. Waste is not a natural thing.
That's the social side.
That is the social side, and this is actually deals with good governance. It means businesses paying tax.
Yeah.
It also means governments not being corrupt.
Anti-corruption practices.
Anti-corruption is here 100% in there. So no society can function with corruption. No society can function if you don't have basic rules, laws, and regulations. There are still 4 billion people in this world that don't have access to legal systems, which is totally unacceptable. So this goal number 16 is actually a foundation for the Sustainable Development Goals. Countries that have a good governance actually have a higher chance of getting to these Sustainable Development Goals. You see in the United States, even when one president has different ideas, because there is a well-developed democracy, it's very difficult for him alone to make drastic changes. That's a sign actually of a democracy working. We might like or not like the trends that are there, but basically the institutions are holding it. That's here. Obviously a lot of work to do in many parts of the world, as you can imagine. And then partnership is actually a partnership that is not just you and I sign a contract and we are partners. But what the goals recognize, the 17 goals, is that the task that we have in front of us to leave no one behind is such an incredible task that none of us can do this alone. I talked about the business community de-risking the political process. I talked about us having to work together with civil society and what we do with NGOs, the private sector. And this is actually a partnership for the common good. A partnership where we put the interest of others ahead of our own. A partnership that is a multi-generational partnership. That everything we do needs to make sense for generations to come. Very much, again, very well ingrained in Buddhism as well. So it's a moral partnership for the common good. And actually, as a result, we made this goal number 17, which is one goal that I always champion, because that partnership, again, is the foundation for all the other Sustainable Development Goals.
Great. It's incredible how you can explain all the 17 points with all the details and progress reports and your projections of how things will be coming.
And we didn't even talk the 169 targets behind it.
No, not yet.
That's for another time.
Yeah, right. Paul's passion and total devotion to this development target, sustainable development targets, is just unbelievable. I don't believe there is another person in this world who can really appreciate and explain and project and then really fight for it, just like Paul. So Paul, what would you do after you retire?
Well, that's a long answer, but you don't retire. I don't believe in retiring anymore.
Retiring from Unilever. Are you not going to retire from Unilever?
Well, that day will come. We're all mortals, so that will come one day. But you can in Unilever. The reason I like this company, and I hope the same is the case for the audience, is because you can actually, the values that you have and the passion that you have, you can actually make that come alive.
All right.
Our brands, a toilet cleaning brand that builds 25 million toilets to fight open defecation is goal number 6.
Yeah.
Or the work that we do with the Unilever Foundation in gender education is goal number 5, or gender equality.
Yeah.
Or the work we do with Knorr and giving kids in Thailand breakfast for school is part of the goal number 2 of food security. So what we really are good at, any of our brands, make them purpose-driven. And these brands grow very fast. You can have a tremendous impact in this company right now doing this. Undoubtedly, if I am not directly linked to this company, I'd first of all support it 100% wherever I am. Yeah. But then I would also look at other opportunities that are certainly emerging where you can help make these goals come alive. It's not only that we need Unilever, we actually need a lot of others to do this and do this together. We've created the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which I'm a chairman of, where you have 200 of the most progressive companies that come together and drive change. I'm a board member of the UN Global Compact, which has 35,000 companies connected to this. In fact, you're starting a chapter of the Global Compact in Thailand now. So there are many other organizations that if your task is finished here and if there's someone else that can take over, which is a good thing at times that there is change, there are many other areas where our needs are absolutely needed to make this come alive. So I'm not sure that I will ever be unemployed. Don't worry about that.
What would Unilever be like without Paul Pullman?
Would be a much better place.
วันนี้รายการไทม์ไลน์สุทธิชัยหยุ่นหมดเวลากันแล้วค่ะ สัปดาห์หน้าพบกับไทม์ไลน์สุทธิชัยหยุ่นได้ใหม่ทุกวันเสาร์ 20:45 น.